Good morning. So thank you for the opportunity to present as part of the Emiquan Science Symposium. My name is Trent Ford. I'm the state climatologist of Illinois. I'm based at the State Water Survey here at the University of Illinois in Champaign. And today I'm going to talk about, as the title shows, landscape management challenges and solutions, as well to our changing climate and all of the challenges that that it gives us here in Illinois. So, this is the elevator pitch for climate change in Illinois. We've gotten warmer and we've gotten wetter. And that is very similar to most of the changes we've seen across the Midwest region. But although this is maybe where we can start with describing climate change in Illinois over the last 125 years or so, and projections indicate continued trends of warmer and wetter climate into the future, this sort of doesn't really get us to the nuanced discussion of the impacts, especially when it comes to landscape management, that we really need to discuss and understand when it comes to solutions. So oftentimes that warmer and wetter trend that we've seen and are projected to continue to see leads to oversimplifications like what's shown in this map, which is from the USGCRP in 2009. And I've seen more recent renditions of something like this, where we take the average temperature of Illinois, the total amount of precipitation we get over the course of the year, we project that out to 2050 or 2100 or whatever year we care about, and then match up what's called a climate analog. And in this case, what this is showing is that our average temperature and our projected total amount of precipitation is by, let's say, 2070 or 2080 in the central Illinois region is more like East Texas by mid-century or late century, whatever that means. And and this is, this is I suppose, a powerful illustration of the changing climate, but it again really doesn't get us where we need to go. And in reality, it can do more harm than good, because from this, you could say, well, maybe we should start considering species compositions that are more like East Texas, when in reality, of course, that landscape management is far more complicated. Even when you throw away the important considerations of soil and, competitor species, ecosystem makeup, all of those, just considering the climate, even that is just an oversimplification. Because if we think about something like a tree, we plant a tree today, hopefully that tree is still living 50 years from now and thriving. That tree is experiencing climate change through these changes in the average annual temperature and the total amount of precipitation, but it's also experiencing climate change insofar as the extremes and those disturbances that we probably care about more so, things like drought, changing in heavy precipitation, extreme heat. But also, as I'll talk about here in a second, our climate's changing, especially our winter, to make a more conducive environment for native or non-native or invasive species of weeds, fungal and bacterial diseases, pathogens, and insect pests. And so when we think about landscape management and a changing climate, it's far more complicated than just simply thinking about, okay, getting warmer and wetter. And so that's sort of how I want to set up this discussion for today, is to think about climate change. Again, when we're talking in a 2-minute spot to the media, we can talk about warmer and wetter. But when we have these broader discussions about landscape management, we have to think a bit more nuanced than that. So, in reality, what are the climate change problems that we need to prepare for? First and foremost, I think when it comes to landscape management is our changing seasonality. Winters are warming. Every season is warming in Illinois. Winters are warming at about 5 times the rate of summers historically, and that's projected to continue. The impacts that this causes is a mixed bag. Some are what we maybe consider positive for landscape management, some are more negative. So, for example, a lower risk of kill temperatures for certain types of species. Now, that could be a positive if you're trying to, establish different types of species that may have not been suitable to the central Illinois climate, 30, 40, 50 years ago. But it also means that those kill temperatures in the wintertime are happening less frequently, which means you can get an expansion of non-native or invasive species of plants and animals, like our friends the armadillo, that are, I don't want to say plaguing, but are definitely more present in southern Illinois than they were, just a few years ago. We also have because of that, a higher incidence of disease and insect pest overwintering. That's a problem for for competition for many of our culturally or economically important species of plants and animals. Um, And this warmer winter is something that shifts our spring phenology, and that can cause some ramifications when it comes to freeze and frost variability. One thing we do see is that for those who are working out in the landscape in winter, warmer winters can have the health benefits of less extreme cold exposure. But at the same time, when you expect your soils to be frozen in the winter to get some work done, to get heavy equipment on those frozen soils in wintertime, that's not happening as much, especially in central Illinois. Our frozen soils are more ephemeral. It's kind of a freeze thaw process now, and that can create some frustration. So this kind of mixed bag just generally means that there's not necessarily a single strategy. And right at the end, I'll talk about strategies, but not necessarily a single strategy to deal with these changes in seasonality. But it's kind of a shift in the mindset of how we do things. We also have a longer and warmer growing season. Compare the growing season length across the state from 1961 to 1990 compared to the most recent 30-year period. And you can see in the area that Emaquan is in, we've increased the amount of growing degree day accumulation in our average growing season by about 100 to 150. And that's projected to continue to increase. And so what this means is that it can change the species composition as well as the amount of competition and suitability for overall species because of not only a warmer winter, but a longer and warmer growing season. Something that we're seeing in the summertime is an increase in the frequency of heat and humidity. And of course, this causes stress to plants and animals, but it also causes stress to the people who are working in that environment. On the top there, I'm showing a plot of the trend in the extreme heat hours. So this is the number of hours we get above what the National Weather Service and CDC considers potentially hazardous when it comes to extreme heat for humans as well as animals. And you can see that consistently upward trend, a trend of about 5.5 additional hours per year in Peoria over the last 70, 80 years. So really significant in the frequency of extreme heat. And the bottom plot shows that's projected to continue the number of days over 95 degrees. So like I mentioned, this not only stresses plants, it also stresses the people, the workers who are out there working in these conditions, which creates a workplace hazard issue. But because it's not just the heat in Illinois that's increasing, it's the humidity, it also makes for a really conducive environment for fungal disease, which is something we're seeing both in our natural landscape environments as well as our agricultural conditions. And then switching to rainfall, we've gotten wetter in Illinois, but I would argue that the bigger impact is that the rain is coming in heavier doses, more intense rainfall, which means more runoff. Now, in our developed areas, when we're talking to municipalities and cities, we're talking about overwhelmed stormwater drainage systems that can lead to flooding outside of map floodplains, like what I'm showing you here from Bloomington Normal a few years ago. But in our more natural landscapes, we can consider issues of soil erosion, stream bank erosion, and of course water quality from nutrient runoff, especially from agricultural lands. So this creates a landscape management issue where we're dealing with just more power from more runoff from these heavier storms overall. And when it comes to wetland management, of course, the best time to do wetland management is during drought. What we're seeing is more frequent sort of ephemeral types of flooding events that really create issues when it comes to the time and the windows of opportunity to do that management. Now, I mentioned drought. Drought is really complicated when it comes to climate change. Everything's complicated when it comes to climate change. Drought is particularly so. So I'll say this that there's a narrative out there that drought is becoming more frequent in Illinois, and that's actually not true necessarily. When we think about drought, we think about long time scales, and we're seeing less or fewer of those long-term droughts where we go from one year to another year where we have drought that persists from year to year. However, what we're seeing, and especially in the summertime, is more evaporation as the air warms. It has a higher thirst for evaporation, and it takes a lot more water from the land surface. And so what that means is if we're not getting consistent and gentle rains to replenish that evaporation, it can lead to rather rapid dry down of our soils. And so although we're seeing not necessarily any kind of long-term change in drought frequency, we are seeing more frequent flash drought. That's where we get the rapid onset of drought conditions that can lead to really quick impacts to landscapes. And of course, you can see here, what our landscape composition is really does matter. When we're thinking about a pretty, suburban kind of landscape, we're thinking about turf grass, which only has, maybe an inch or two of roots, versus some of our more important drought, especially drought resistant native species of plants like lead plant, for example. But just as an example of how this takes effect, I use the example from 2023. This is a photo of actually my front lawn here. Most of my native plants in the landscape were doing fine, but my grass was not. Obviously, the turf grass again has those shallow rooting depths. But we go from, yeah, things are dry in mid-May. We're doing okay though, all the way to our stock pond dropping well below normal by June. So over a 6-week period we see, which is a relatively short period of time, we go from, yeah, this is kind of droughty, but not too bad, to, wow, this is actually pretty severe, and we lost this dock here, which was kind of a piece of crap to begin with, but nonetheless, it was a lost thing. So you can see just over that time period, we go from most of the state of Illinois not being in drought to the vast majority being in moderate to severe drought in a relatively short period of time. So when it comes to drought conditions and managing for that drought, we need to understand that although we're having a wetter climate overall in Illinois, we're still seeing that precipitation variability that can lead to those rapid drought conditions. So just planting or increasing the composition of your species in your ecosystems that can deal with wetter conditions, but maybe less tolerant of drought isn't necessarily going to be the best plan, because even though we're not seeing those long-term droughts, we're still seeing those frequent flash droughts that can cause impacts to ecology. Okay, so that's sort of the problems. And I know it's a relatively short time period to talk about all these issues with climate change, but I sort of laid them out there. I think the three biggest things that are the challenges that are facing landscape management when it comes to climate change are changing seasonality, especially with warming winters and longer growing season, extreme heat and humidity in the summertime, and wetter conditions, heavier rainfall, but also more variable rain that can lead to more flash droughts. So let's talk about the positive, the strategies and solutions. So first of all, the first thing we need to consider when it comes to climate change is mitigating climate change, which is actually solving the problem. Climate change is driven by global warming. Global warming is driven by increase in carbon dioxide concentrations that's caused almost entirely by human emissions of greenhouse gases from burning of fossil fuels over the last 150 years or so. So what that means is if we want a chance to solve these problems truly, we have to mitigate the actual cause, which is greenhouse gas emissions. So that comes in a number of ways, and I kind of lay that out here. Transportation, things like electrification where it makes sense, but also accessible, efficient, safe public transit, compact and walkable living spaces. And we also think about green spaces when we think about those walkable living spaces, so that really matters when it comes to landscape architecture and landscape management. When it comes to power and electricity, thinking about renewable low carbon energy, solar and wind being the top of that list, but also energy efficiency and passive cooling and design. So you can see here a lot of this when it comes to transportation as well as power is more about design than it is necessarily about technological advancement. For industry and manufacturing, electrification where it makes sense, using sustainable materials in production, all of these things are really important. And then for agriculture and food systems, and I would say this is part of a landscape management as well. Soil, water, and land conservation are extremely important. Supporting local production, having a climate conscious diet, reducing food waste, all of these are really important, and it really takes a collective effort. We think about this as maybe a cafeteria style, where not all of us are going to be able to take all of these strategies personally or individually, but we can, through our work, through our civic engagement, through our personal lives, can make a difference in some of these, which again collectively makes a huge difference. And then I think probably more importantly to the individual, and certainly when it comes to landscape management, is adaptation, adapting to climate change. And I'll say it starts local. First, planning and design, thinking about planned and accessible green space, right? What species are we planting? We talk about planting trees in cities all the time to reduce the urban heat island effect, but what trees are we planting? How are those trees maintained? How are we supporting biodiversity through that tree planting? uh, and how can we make sure that those trees produce the cooling benefits that we have so they're not stressed in times of, for example, drought. Ecosystem health and services, right? And the native and beneficial plants, land management, habitat restoration, nature-based solutions for dealing with extremes in the amount of water. So going from heavy rainfall to drought, having extreme heat. How can we use our landscape development to make those differences? And I think about hazard mitigation, hazard planning, and this can come from in landscape management as well as thinking about what are we doing when we have a drought? What are we doing when we have a flood? How can we take advantage of those situations to advance the goals for ecosystem management and restoration? And then a just transition, making sure it's not just those communities with resources that get to see the benefit of adapting to climate change, but that all communities can. The last example I want to give here, and this is my last slide before I wrap up, is I'm using this from the latest National Climate Assessment, which was published in 2023. This is the RAD framework when it comes to thinking about ecosystem health: the resist, accept, and direct. We can think of these things as three distinct pathways to ecosystem management in a changing climate. The first is resist. This is the idea that climate's changing, but I don't care. I want my ecosystem makeup and species composition to look like this, the way it has the last 30 years. I don't want to change it. Now that is likely possible, but given these changes in seasonality, extreme heat, so on and so forth in Illinois, that's really resource intensive. And as we know, resources for habitat restoration and ecosystem services is not great. So that can be a real challenge. Then there's the accept framework, which is basically just say let her go in my mind, which is the climate's changing, winters are warming, we're getting more extreme heat. Let it go and see what the ecosystem, how it balances, and no doubt it will likely reach some sort of equilibrium. But I think the major question with this type of framework is that going to be an equilibrium that we want? Is that going to be something that's beneficial to humans and the overall environment? Maybe, maybe not. Then there's a third option, which I think is probably the best one. That's direct. This idea that our climate's changing. We have to deal with that. And the fact is that our current species makeup or historical species composition and makeup and our management strategies and the timing on which we make those management decisions may not be ideal for our changing climate. So how can we adjust the things that we're doing, the species that we're using to accomplish the same goals and get the same benefits as we were before, but the ecosystem itself may look a little bit different. And that I think is not only resource efficient, but it's a way of accomplishing our goals despite our changing climate. So it's just, I think this is a neat way to kind of look at climate change. So with that, I'll wrap up, and I'm online to take questions. I just again want to thank the organizers for letting me take up some of your time by talking about climate change, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Beyond this presentation, my contact information is down here. Please feel free to reach out if you ever have questions, resources, anything like that. So thank you very much.